Hi, this is Council Kowski for AP Gov Review, and in this video we're going to be looking at the major differences in Congress between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So, right out of the AP Gov curriculum, you see there are two learning standards that we will be covering in this short video. So let's get into it. So, overview of Congress. Certainly the Founding Fathers did intend for Congress to be the central policy-making body. This was important because, keep in mind, this is the way in which it would be very responsive to the people. This is the way as built into the Madisonian model where you have separation of branches and powers, in which it's going to prevent tyranny. And of course, Congress is the only part of our three branches that can make policy. Now, there are, of course, exceptions when you look at the presidency with respect to executive orders, or the judicial branch with respect to judicial activism. But for the most part, the majority of laws and regulations that we have today come from Congress. And the other two branches, as I mentioned, tend to be rarer exceptions. But the House, in particular, was supposed to be most directly in touch with the people. We know that because you have 435 members in the House of Representatives today, and they were reelected or dumped out every 2 years. And again, that is a very quick process compared to the Senate. So the House was supposed to be most directly in touch with the people and intended to be the most powerful branch as advocated by Madison in Federalist Paper number 51. But what is interesting is that approval ratings are at historic lows for Congress. And despite the fact that they are the direct link between people and policy, they do not tend to have excellent job approval ratings, with the exception of people's own congressperson. They tend to love their own congressperson, but they tend to hate Congress as an institution. Quite interesting and quite ironic in many respects. But again, when we look at this chart here, you see that the people, in terms of relaying their interests, their problems, concerns, do so through elections, and in particular the election of who's going to make up eventually the legislature, which is the, of course, policy-making institution. So some of the perks of the job, you don't really need to know this for the AP Gov exam, but again, just to, some background information here, $174,000 is the salary as of 2018. You get some office space in D.C., which of course is not cheap, and you have travel allowances, you have your own staff, and you have something called franking privileges, where you're able to literally send out to your constituents mail for free. So you don't even have to pay anything, and some Congress people tend to abuse this privilege a little bit more. But again, it costs them nothing, so you could be basically sending out whatever you want, bragging about certainly your accomplishments or what you've achieved or whatever it may be, and it's all paid for, free, no expense on the part of the congressperson. But it is important to note that as much as people rag upon Congress people, it does require long hours, a lot of time away from home and family, and pressure from others to support policies. And again, imagine if you are the congressperson from Hawaii or Alaska or California, Nevada, etc. A lot of time away from your family, and that's quite a distance, as opposed to if you live in Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware, those areas. It's probably going to be a little bit easier and less taxing. So what we have in Congress is called American bicameralism. Look at the word bicameral, right? That means two, and you're going to have two chambers. And our first one, of course, is the House of Representatives, followed by the Senate. So in the House, you have 435 members, and they serve 2 terms of office. And what's important, remember that they are most directly in touch with the people. All revenue bills start in the House. The Senate cannot introduce a bill that has to do with revenue in terms of taxing or tax cuts. All of that has to start in the House. What's also unique about the House is that they actually have a rule committee, and that governs all bills, all legislation that is proposed. The House is also more, if you will, strict when it comes to rules, more formalized. They have fewer debates, they are timed, and of course, as you hopefully do know, that the House, the members are determined by population, meaning that states that have more people are ultimately going to have more representatives in office. And as you would imagine, there's going to be less compromise simply just due to the sheer size of 435 people. Getting them to agree on anything in a country as diverse, especially when you look at geography as the United States, is going to be quite difficult. When we contrast this to the Senate, certainly you have 100 members, 2 members per state, as per, if you recall, the Great Compromise, coming right out of sort of the New Jersey plan, and then we merged the New Jersey and Virginia plan to get what we have today. But every 2 years, a third of the Senate is up for re-election, so no more than a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And again, it's supposed to be the more steady, wiser part of Congress. It is supposed to give advice in consent, and we see this certainly on foreign affairs as well as judicial affairs. So if you've ever seen a justice getting grilled by senators, that is where they are trying to, basically vet that judicial candidate and ultimately determine whether or not he or she is going to get confirmed. Unlike the House, the Senate actually has unlimited debates, and that, of course, is known as a filibuster. And again, as I mentioned before, it is supposed to be the wiser, more sophisticated branch, at least by design. And of course, just simply due to size, once again, unlike the House, you're going to see more compromise. 100 people agreeing on something versus 435 is just going to be easier for agreement. And then, as I said before, fewer rules in the Senate as compared to the House, but it is actually more prestigious. I mean, becoming a senator, let's say in California, where you have millions upon millions of people, versus Wyoming, which barely has about 500,000 people, more or less, it's going to be easier in Wyoming as compared to California. But generally speaking, being a member of the Senate is definitely much more prestigious in nature. So, how do congressmen or congresspersons behave? Well, you have 3 different ways. You have what's called the constituents' views, where they're going to keep in touch with voters' views, read their mail, keep in touch with local leaders, such as mayors and town council members, and they're going to vote the way of their constituents. Versus party views, where Congress is, of course, organized along party lines, such as, are you Republican or are you a Democrat? Those tend to be just the main 2 views. And actually, what's interesting is that party view actually tends to be the biggest predictor of a vote. So I would certainly note that, especially if you were to see that on a question. I would not be surprised on an AP Gov exam. And then you do have some that do vote based on personal views, so their own values certainly are going to impact policy-making decisions. And we saw this with former Senator John McCain, who during one of the parts of the repeal for the Affordable Care Act mandate, he voted down, and he did not vote with the Republican Party based on his own personal views. But if you do, again, look at party line vote, even 2012, I think that's the biggest predictor. In some cases, it's high, about 68%, and right now looking about 65% as of 2012. So certainly that is going to explain how they vote. Okay, moving on. So interestingly enough, up until the 17th Amendment, senators were actually only elected by the members of the state legislature. And the role of the Senate, as I mentioned, which is supposed to be the wiser branch, it was designed to check the excess of democracy of the House of Representatives, as if the House of Representatives is going to be this rogue chamber of Congress that has to be reined in by the Senate. And at this point, really, up until the 17th Amendment, the senators are millionaires, hence called the Millionaires Club, and you would imagine that some money would certainly be involved under the table. But once you get the 17th Amendment, then you have eventually people voting on the senators quite directly. So how is leadership organized? Well, you have in the House, you have a Speaker of the House who is elected by the House members and is the dominant party within the House and presides over the House and has a lot of influence and arguably the most powerful person in Washington other than the president. And the Speaker of the House is going to assign committees to certain individuals. Now, we have not gone to committees quite yet, but every committee more or less has some power. Some committees are not going to have a lot of power, such as if you're on the Aging Committee. I mean, what are you going to be doing on the Aging Committee? Versus if you are on, let's say, the Ways and Means Committee, which controls taxation. Taxation is a big committee to be on. So certainly the Speaker of the House has a big role right there. And the Speaker of the House is going to be assisted by the Majority Leader, who essentially is like the VP of the House, if you will. It's ordinarily seen as a stepping stone eventually to the Speaker's position. And then you have your whips, who are the go-between between members in leadership, right? Making sure that the members are, at the end of the day, voting along party line or loyal to the party. So in the House, it's going to be more formal, it's definitely more structured, you have more rules, and we definitely see party loyalty much, much stronger. Again, there's 435 members, so certainly parties are going to try to have a strong grip on its members. Versus the Senate, they are actually technically led by the vice president, but the vice president, as you may or may not know, only casts a vote in the event of a tie, whether that's a nomination or a tie in votes in the Senate. Other than that, the vice president really doesn't have much power. Typically what you're going to have is you're not going to have the vice president showing up. You have somebody called a president pro tempore, who is a senior member of the party. It's more of a ceremonial position, who presides over the Senate. Really, the bulk of the power is led by the majority leader, which is the equivalent of the Speaker of the House, but in the Senate, as seen by being chosen by the party members. And their biggest role is determining the Senate agenda. If you don't like certain bills, well, you never have to put it up for a vote. I mean, that is a lot of power if you think about the thousands upon thousands of bills that are proposed every year. They are also assisted by whips, as we said, go-betweens between the members in the leaderships who are supposed to, quote-unquote, whip the vote. And they must work, though, with the minority leader of the other party in terms of trying to get things done. Of course, this does not always happen, as Washington tends to be very partisan. But nevertheless, you do tend to see more compromise in the Senate as opposed to the House. And again, sheer numbers ultimately help with that. And those are little titles here. So, again, here are major differences between the House and the Senate. Certainly be familiar with that. Big part here, too, the limited debates in the House versus unlimited debate in the Senate. So, again, very interesting when you compare these two chambers of Congress. And moving on, you have the Speaker of the House, former Speaker here, Paul Ryan, or I should say not former yet, but as of making this video, he will be former very soon. But certainly your role here, if you're the Speaker of the House, is recognizing members who wish to speak, ruling on questions of parliamentary procedure, are they following rules accordingly. Big part here, as I said earlier, in terms of appointing members to committees, directing business on the floor. Again, similar to the Senate Majority Leader, you are ultimately going to be determining what bills are going to be moving along and which ones may just fall behind and never get a chance to see the light of day. Also, a lot of political behind-the-scenes influence. In many ways, you are the leader of Congress, you are the leader of your party in Congress, so that's important. You also are going to be appointing party legislative leaders, especially in certain bills and certain interests that each party might have. And then, as I said earlier, substantial, this cannot be emphasized enough, control over which bills get assigned through which committees, and ultimately, will they eventually make it out of committee for a vote? That is a lot of power, again, when you think about all the bills that go through Congress and that are proposed. The minority whips, again, as I said earlier, go between for the members of leadership and for members of important bills, because there are a lot of votes that do come out, and they will take sort of a nose count for the leaders. Do we have enough support on this bill to get it passed? And if we don't, well, they might be pressuring members to support the leadership. So again, very important there. So that's where we're going to stop right now, and hopefully you got a better understanding of the differences between the House and the Senate.